At the end, we will answer questions. Well, today we have Dr. Christine Bertz, and she currently serves as research faculty at the University of Memphis Center for Research and Educational Policy, a state of Tennessee center of excellence. She designs and conducts research evaluations of projects that aim to improve the quality of STEM teaching and learning throughout the United States. She holds a PhD in biology from the University of Mississippi, where her research focused on interactions between native and invasive plants within xeric scrub ecosystems following large-scale disturbance. Her background also includes work in exotic animal physiology and captive husbandry, surface water quality, and the distribution of threatened and endangered prairie plants. Dr. Bertz also serves in a volunteer capacity on the board of directors of the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. So, Dr. Bertz, please take it away. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I want to share this with you. All right, so first of all, I want to thank you all for signing on today. I know this is a little unusual in terms of format. It's a bit new for me too. I'm used to having an audience in front of me, and I'm used to talking with my hands. So you'll see my hands flailing a lot, even though there's no one really to see all of that. I want to start by apologizing for my title. Plant biochemistry sounds like a really dull and boring topic, and I wanted something that conveyed a sense of drama and excitement. And in the process, I did the colon thing. You know, that thing that you do where you cram all of the technical speak after the colon, and then you can get away with calling it whatever you want. So in the process of trying to write a webinar title that didn't sound like a lecture, I made up the most academic title I possibly could, and I didn't intend to, and I'm very sorry. But I hope at least I gave you a sense of drama, because it's hard to convey like drama when you're talking about plants, right? It's easy in the animal kingdom. Animal competition looks like this. Like, it's big, it's loud. It's the introduction to every episode of Marty Stauffer's Wild America during the, by the way, 23 years it ran on PBS. It ran from, I looked this up, it ran from 1982 to 2005. We couldn't do Wild America for the plant kingdom. Like, it wouldn't work, right? Wild America for plants would be 30 minutes of this. And then maybe a bird would fly across the screen. And then you would stare at this again. And it would get terrible ratings, it just wouldn't play. But the truth is that a lot of the same things are happening in this picture as are happening in the photo on the previous slide. It's just happening a lot more quietly. But these plants also have to defend themselves, they have to compete for resources, they have to find mates, they have to produce as many offspring as possible. And they're doing a lot of the same things, like root networks are struggling to find nutrients in water before other plants get to them. Some of these plants have formed alliances with bacteria and fungi in order to get to nutrients better. A lot of them have created structural defenses, things like the thorns on a rose, in order to defend themselves from herbivores. And many of them have created chemical defenses and chemical weapons in order to gain an advantage. And it's these last couple of things that I'm going to talk about today. So on the surface, a plant's to-do list is very, very short. It just has to do two things, right? It has to grow and it has to reproduce. These are what we consider a plant's basic functions. And growth and reproduction, whether a plant is reproducing by seed or clonally, like sending out runners, as many plants can do, these things still require resources, things like amino acids and carbohydrates and proteins, vitamins, like things that we find in every cell of every organism that, just like us, a plant can't survive without. But it turns out a plant's to-do list is really a little bit longer than this. It has a lot of other ecologically important things that, while not basic functions, support growth and reproduction and are so helpful that in many cases the plant can't succeed very well or at all without them. And these things also require chemical compounds in order to happen. So We refer to compounds that are directly involved with growth and reproduction, those carbs and lipids and vitamins, as primary metabolites. And I will never talk about primary metabolites again for the rest of this talk. All of the other things that a plant does that requires other chemical compounds, we refer to as secondary metabolites. And we categorize them according to their chemical structure into different classes. Now, if you're a chemist or super into chemistry, this list is probably very meaningful to you. I am not a chemist. What this list tells me about secondary metabolites is that there are a whole lot of them. And we have barely scratched the surface. So this is actually a list from the 20 to 30% of plants that we have analyzed for secondary chemical compounds. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, secondary metabolites have so many different uses and come in so many different flavors, for lack of a better word, that secondary is probably not the greatest name for them. But these are the chemical compounds responsible for attracting pollinators. So the color of a rose, the scent of a rose, the result of these secondary metabolites. Many of them have antimicrobial properties, so they defend against pathogens. They can actually sometimes attract predators that feed on the insects that damage and threaten a plant. Many of them are involved in signaling. They signal to beneficial bacteria and fungi that, hey, we could do some great things together if we teamed up. They're also used for chemical signaling, both within the plant itself and for plants to signal to other plants chemically. That's a thing that we know happens now. And in particular today, I'm going to focus on these last two. Many secondary metabolites are toxins or repellents for herbivores or can inhibit competing plants in some way. And as humans, of course, we've gotten really good at co-opting a lot of these secondary metabolites for our own purposes. Flavoring and taste are due to the secondary metabolites in a plant. If, like me, you think cilantro tastes like soap and misery, that's because of an aldehyde secondary compound that the cilantro produces. In industry, we use secondary metabolites to create things like rubber and lacquer. Urushiol, the secondary metabolite in poison ivy that makes us violently allergic to it in some cases, can be used to make lacquer. We also use secondary metabolites as a foundation or to teach us how to make a lot of both pharmaceutical and recreational drugs. So caffeine, nicotine, THC, morphine, cocaine are all alkaloid secondary metabolites produced by plants for their own purposes. So if you enjoyed your morning coffee or you're trying really hard not to fall asleep right now, you can thank a plant for producing what is for it an insecticide. Now, I've told you nothing new. You already knew all of this because you already knew about the monarch butterfly and the milkweed plant, right? So monarchs are toxic to vertebrate predators, things like frogs and birds and lizards that would like to eat them. And they're toxic because as caterpillars, they feed specifically on the milkweed plant, which produces produces a toxin that serves as an insecticide against most other insects. So it's the milkweed, not the monarch, that produces this toxin, but the monarch has learned how to ingest it safely and store it, which as an adult and as a caterpillar makes it taste bad to some of its predators, which learn not to eat monarchs. And then the viceroy piggybacks on that by saying, oh, look at me, I'm a monarch. You don't want to eat me, I don't taste good. And this is all because the milkweed plant is producing a secondary metabolite. The type of compound it produces, by the way, is something called a cardiac glycoside, which, as the name suggests, interferes with heart function. This compound, or this class of compound, is produced in variation across several other plant families. One in particular produces a couple of compounds that probably sound familiar to you. Digoxin and digitoxin, produced in the foxglove plant, are used by humans in medical uses for heart medications. So the classes of these chemical compounds, as we see here, like there is a broad class that appears across different families, but the individual structures produced by individual plants can be very specific to that plant. They can also be very specific to the target that they are meant to defend against or affect. And this is a part of my webinar where I get to tell you a fairy tale. Once upon a time, European colonists came to North America, and they brought with them parsnips as a tasty food crop. Now, after that, the parsnip escaped cultivation, and it's now a pretty widespread and nasty invasive species. But the interesting thing is that when the parsnip was brought to North America, it escaped its co-evolved insect herbivore, which remained in Europe, cleverly named the parsnip webworm. In Europe, the parsnip produces a suite of secondary metabolites called furanocoumarins, if you're keeping track, that defend specifically against that webworm. And so what we saw is after the parsnip came to North America, wild populations just sort of stopped making that chemical. Until about 1870, when the webworm made it across the pond. And then within about 20 years, populations of parsnip, like that concentration of furanocoumarin, shot back up again. This was not, of course, like a deliberate choice on the plant's part. This is natural selection, meaning that the plants that produced less furanocoumarin and more, say, more seeds or more growth did better over time until the webworm was back in its life. So what this tells us is that these secondary metabolites are expensive for a plant to produce. Like there's a cost in resources and energy to do that. And as long as there is something to defend against, as long as there is a reason for it, that expense is worth it in terms of the return on investment that the plant gets. So typically if a plant is producing a secondary metabolite like this, there's a reason for it. We know all this happened, by the way, because researchers went back and took samples from herbarium specimens that botanists had collected over like hundreds and hundreds of years to analyze for the content of these furanocoumarins. So that's pretty cool if you're like a plant collector. That is the reason that we know this happened. Furanocoumarins, by the way, the fact that there is a lot of them in parsnip now is not great for us as humans because it is incredibly toxic to us. If you get parsnip sap on your skin, it's not a big deal. If you get parsnip sap on your skin and your skin is exposed to sunlight, then poison ivy has got nothing on the rash that you can get. And I bring this up because wild parsnip looks a lot like the plant in this slide, which is not wild parsnip. This is golden Alexander's. It is a benign native plant, but it grows in some of the same places as parsnip does. So if you're the kind of person that likes to go out and collect seeds and botanize and like bring things back and plant them in your yard, be really careful and make sure that you know your ID if you're going out to look for golden Alexander, something with this yellow umbel flower. So this compound furanocoumarins also occurs across several other plant families. One of them you're familiar with, I know, because last year or the year before, giant hogweed made a huge splash in the media. It's this big plant in the carrot family that produces a terrible, terrible rash. And it's also invasive in the southeastern United States. It is related to wild parsnip, and it's the same mechanism. They call it phytophotodermatitis, which is a great word for a terrible process. Furanocoumarins also occur in a lower concentration in Queen Anne's lace, in both celery and in limes. There's something that's referred to as bartender's itch that can be just a mild dermatitis on the fingers of people who do a lot of like cutting celery and lime frequently. That reaction is a reaction to the furanocoumarins. This is also the compound in grapefruit that means you can't eat grapefruit or drink grapefruit juice while you are on certain medications because it interferes with those medications. Finally, furanocoumarins occur in the sap of the fig plant in an entirely different family. And I bring this up mostly because I can include this great picture of a fig that looks like Demogorgon from Stranger Things. So if you watch that show, then you're looking at the fig and just know that I'm there with you and I see it too. Okay, so plants use secondary metabolites for a whole bunch of things. They're widespread And they are relatively specific both to the plant that produces them and the target that they are meant to affect. They're expensive to make, and natural selection then is going to play a role for when it is appropriate for a plant to make these chemicals and when it doesn't make any sense. Some plants hedge their bets in this respect. So instead of producing this expensive compound all the time, they'll just do it on demand. For example, if a caterpillar takes a bite out of a plant, it may recognize that it's under attack and start producing its chemical defense at that time. And this is one of the coolest studies that I've read lately. Someone did a study where they played the sound of a caterpillar eating a plant to that plant. And the plant responded by jacking up the concentration of defensive chemicals it was making. Like, plants can hear sound in some sense. And so if anyone ever makes fun of you for singing to your plant, then this is your defense against that. Okay, so plants use secondary metabolites to interact with animals, with fungi, with microbes. It should make absolute sense to you at this point that they also use them to interact with other plants. The inhibition of the growth or reproduction of a plant by chemicals from another plant is called allelopathy. And this is one of the coolest things that I think is out there in the plant world. Allelopathy is something that we can see happening in our own yards. For example, in this picture, you see the bare patch sort of between the English ivy in the corner and the grasses and flowers in the center. That is a result of a secondary metabolite that's being produced by English ivy that's keeping other things from growing there. So if you have a place in your yard where there's no reason that nothing is growing there, it might be allelopathy. If you've been to any of my invasive plant talks, and you know I really like to pick on English ivy, and I'm going to pick on it some more today. This is just another reason why if you have English ivy in your yard that like maybe you don't want to have it there. In addition to the fact that it harbors pathogens and slugs and rats and invades natural areas and damages your structures, also it's allelopathic. Allelopathy can occur in a lot of different ways. It can inhibit the growth of a plant's, like a competitor plant's roots, which of course would mean that plant can absorb fewer nutrients, absorb less water. It can interact or inhibit shoot growth, which would prevent the plant from producing energy through photosynthesis. And in some cases, it cuts out the middleman and will just inhibit those seeds from germinating in the first place. We even see cases where plants inhibit the germination of their own seeds, which is something called autotoxicity. And on the surface, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does prevent a plant from having to compete with their own offspring. And if it's something that's going to survive year after year and lay down a seed bank, then essentially when that adult plant dies, it leaves that space to its offspring, and those seeds that have been building up there and not sprouting can take off and reclaim that space. So in some cases, autotoxicity might be a good strategy. When we talk about allelopathy and these, we call them allelochemicals, usually we're thinking of something that has entered the soil. It can get there by washing off of leaves or leaf litter. It can be secreted directly from the roots into the soil, or it can be released during the decay of plant matter that has fallen and is dead. So like leaf litter will decay and produce an allelochemical that then is absorbed by the soil. There are some cases where an allelochemical is volatilized into the air. Camphor does this. If a camphor plant is bitten by a caterpillar, then it volatilizes chemical into the air that, among other things, can inhibit the growth of plants in its immediate vicinity. So that's pretty cool. Like if I'm under attack by webworms or something and I can give off something that makes me more competitive against other plants, that gives me an advantage when maybe I most need it, if I am a camphor plant. One thing about allelopathy is that it's very difficult to demonstrate because there are so many different ways it works and so many potential sources. And while all of that is happening and we're trying to figure out where what this chemical is, where it comes from, and how it's impacting neighboring plants, there are 5 or 6 other things happening in the environment, right? A plant's growth is impacted by whether or not it's getting enough light, enough water. Is it being eaten by a rabbit? Is it experiencing herbivory? Are there soil microbes that are impacting its growth? Is it competing with other plants? There is so much going on. So to try and tease out the effect of a chemical compound upon a neighboring plant in the middle of all of that is very, very difficult. But one of the things that we are learning as allelopathy develops as a field is that it may be one of the reasons that invasive species succeed. So invasive species, meaning plants from other parts of the world that are detrimental to an ecosystem or to human health, that have been introduced to our area and are doing very, very well. Typically, they bring something new to the table. They bring a novel weapon, and one of those novel weapons may be these allelochemicals, which our local plants have not had to experience in the past and have no defense against. I started to make a more complete list of all of the invasive plants for which we have some evidence that they may produce these allelochemicals, but it was way too long. So this is an abbreviated list of plants that may be allelopathic, that we have some evidence that they are, that are either here in Tennessee already or are considered an emerging threat. If you'd like to read about this kind of thing, if this is intriguing to you, I will refer you specifically to spotted knapweed, otherwise known as the invasive plant with an ever-changing scientific name. Like one day we're going to decide what to call it and stick with it, but so far not so much. It produces an allelochemical, and we know of two native plants, blanket flower and silky lupin, the small insects on the right, that produce a different chemical compound that neutralizes the one that knapweed produces. So when you put those two plants together, like their interaction affects everything that's going on around them with other plants, which is pretty cool. Like this is high drama in the plant world. Like eat your heart out, Marty Stauffer. This is very exciting to me. The really cool thing about allelopathy is that it may be a potential alternative for some of our broad spectrum herbicides that we use in agriculture. So we know that there are a number of plants that produce allelochemicals that inhibit common agricultural pest plants. So ryegrass and cereal rye both inhibit a laundry list of these common agricultural weeds. So if you plant rye over the winter, then in the spring, you have to use a lot fewer herbicides on that plot to maintain it. Now we have to be careful with this. As I said, allelochemicals can be very specific. So in this case, one of the things that rye inhibits is germinated grasses, and corn is basically a giant grass. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that the application of both cereal rye and ryegrass on the those left-hand panels has inhibited the germination of corn in those fields. But it's a really interesting idea. One of the nice things about allelochemicals is because they're specific, you get a lot less collateral damage in terms of other plants that perhaps you didn't want to knock back with your herbicide. Another crop plant that is allelopathic is asparagus, which we know inhibits garden cress, ryegrass in the rock, paper, scissors game of allelopathy, and weirdly, asparagus. Asparagus is a plant that exhibits autotoxicity. I have never grown asparagus myself, but if you have, then you probably are familiar with the concept. There's something called asparagus decline, where you just can't plant it in the same place over and over year after year, or it ceases to thrive. So that's autotoxicity, we think, in the asparagus plant. One of the allelochemicals that does this is the not very creatively named asparagusic acid. I bring this up because this is also the chemical that makes some people's urine smell bad after you've eaten asparagus. That's the compound that's doing that. So yeah, great lunch conversation there, right? Closer to home, and there are other agricultural crops that do this, but I'm trying not to talk for 3 hours. Closer to home in our own yard and garden, there are a lot of things that we plant as landscaping plants that also have the potential to be allelopathic, or that have shown allelopathy in some studies, including at least 2 species of sunflower. So if you've noticed, sometimes you don't get a lot of things sprouting or your grass dies under your bird feeder. Some of that, I'm sure, is because birds are tossing down a whole bunch of seed holes there, and it's just a mechanical barrier to growth. And because the doves are down there rooting through it and pulling up anything that they find along the way. But the sunflower seeds, those husks themselves, as they decay, produce an allelochemical. So there's also a chemical inhibition of growth there. We see some allelopathy with sumacs, rhododendron, elderberry. And the bottom of this list probably sounds familiar to anyone who has ever read up on companion planting. So fennel, we know, doesn't play nicely with anything except dill. Everyone says don't plant onions and garlic near certain other things in your garden because they can inhibit the growth of the other plant. So companion planting could be its own talk, is the truth. But one of the things about companion planting is that allelopathy is probably involved. We probably try not to plant things closely together if one plant is producing a secondary metabolite that inhibits the other one. And I cannot talk about allelopathy without mentioning the black walnut, because anyone who's grown up in the Southeast knows that if you have a walnut tree in your yard, that's what you get to have in your yard. That's it. There are a couple of things that will grow under a black walnut, but mainly nothing. The compound responsible for this is called juglone. The walnut family is Juglandaceae, so that's not terribly creative either, but it's nice when some things are logical. Juglone is found both in the hulls of walnut shells and in the roots of the plant itself. And it has a lot of other uses besides inhibiting the growth of things around the walnut. For a long time, juglone has been used as a clothing dye, and by using juglone, I mean we use walnut shells to dye things. To my horror, I learned that you can bust up old walnut shells and put them in a sack and throw them in a body of water to stun and catch fish. Please don't try this at home. I'm looking at my father in particular. Please don't try this at home and tell someone that I told you to do it. But if you like to read about this stuff, there's a lot of interesting literature out there. I did find a mention on a homesteading site that said, if you have a walnut tree and it falls in your pond, get it out of there as quickly as possible, or you might lose a bunch of your fish. And on the medical field, we're now discovering that juglone may have some cancer-fighting properties, so that's something that's being explored that's very cool. So we have the black walnut around here. There are also a number of European species of walnut. It's a big family, and they also produce this phytochemical. So what that means then is that if we go back 2,000 years, Pliny the Elder wrote about black walnut and the inhibition of growth around it. So I have to laugh I had to laugh when I found this quote, because I listened to a podcast called Sawbones that's about medical history and all of the things that we've done wrong. And the running joke on Sawbones is that Pliny the Elder wrote about everything and was right about almost nothing. But he was right about walnut. He wrote, the shadow of the walnut tree is poison to all plants within its compass, which means we've literally known for at least 2,000 years that this sort of plant interaction was possible. It's just only recently have we started to learn about why and how it works. Now, it's starting to sound then like a lot more plants are allelopathic than we originally thought, just as secondary metabolites don't really seem so secondary when we look at them more closely. Many of them have off-label uses for animals, including humans. And this has a lot of implications from a practical standpoint, both in terms of how we plant and what we plant, as well as our own health and safety when handling certain plant materials. Keep in mind, whenever you're working with plants, that they are producing secondary metabolites and that we as humans can have an allergic response to almost anything. I develop a little bit of dermatitis when I pull certain things up in the garden, and you just never know what that's going to be. So be aware of that and be cautious. Secondary metabolites can be both detrimental to human health in the sense of things like drug addiction, and very, very helpful, very beneficial to both health and industry. And there's still many, many chemical compounds that we haven't fully explored. And all of this is happening because plants are constantly engaged in dozens of interactions that we normally can't perceive and don't usually even think about. So if you look at this picture again, hopefully you're thinking about a lot of different things now than you were at the start of this talk. Like, there are so many complex, dynamic chemical interactions happening here and around us all the time. So I hope that you can take that perspective with you the next time you go on a walk through the woods, or go out to work in your garden, or, if I may suggest, on your next visit to the Dixon. So I will finish with that shameless plug for my host. And I think we have time for questions.
Yes, we do have some time for questions. And so we've got a few of them. Let me get to the first one. You mentioned camphor. Does citronella release chemicals into the air like camphor does to help, keep bugs away?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So I have not specifically researched citronella. The fact that it produces a scent tells me that there is something in the air. But like the specific mechanisms of citronella and how that works and where it works, I would have to look into.
Okay, so another one, a very good one. If anyone who's had bamboo knows, they probably never want to have it again. So is there a plant that can be planted in a ring around a stand of bamboo to inhibit the spread?
I love that. Bamboo is a grass, so you could try rye. I've never heard of anything that could be used against bamboo that way. Mostly what we tell people who contact us at Tennessee Invasive Plant Council about bamboo control is to try and put down some sort of mechanical barrier because the root is trying to spread, and if you can keep it from going out, then you reduce that clonal growth. Yeah, bamboo is a bugaboo.
I had a yard with some in it. You're absolutely right. It had bamboo and honeysuckle.
Oh no.
Yes. So another one, you mentioned black walnuts. I live in Cooper Young, and for some reason there are pecan trees everywhere in Cooper Young. And so I'm curious about them. And are pecans and walnuts related? And do pecans have a similar chemical?
Right. Oh, gosh, you're taxing my plant taxonomy knowledge. I believe they are in the same family. I again have not researched pecans specifically, but I've noticed that as well about pecans. It's hard to know when you're looking at those giant trees whether it's shading or whether it's an allelochemical. Puppies. And when you're talking about something with those husks on the ground, like there's a potential for mechanical barrier and the potential that the breakdown is producing something. I don't know specifically on that one.
Okay, one more question that's really good. How do I get rid of English ivy?
Put on gloves, first of all, because English ivy can also cause an allergic reaction to people. And English ivy is one of those, like, it can attenuate. So if you go out and rip it up once and don't have a reaction, you're fine. And you go out again and like the rash can be really, really terrible. I know of 2 or 3 friends who developed English ivy rash last year for the first time. The best thing to do is rip it up. Like it's a mechanical removal, and that's one of the things that can be very hard with invasive species. Because ivy is such great ground cover, it's hard to get it all, even with some sort of an herbicide, unless you can get down to the roots. And by the way, I will add to that, English ivy reminds me of removal of poison ivy. Never ever burn poison ivy, because the allelochemical in poison, like urushiol, can volatilize. We talked about that. It can get into the air and you can get it in your lungs.
That sounds miserable. This is probably kind of the same kind of answer. Someone asked how you can get rid of honeysuckle.
Yeah, again, it's the best thing to do is pull it up, cut it back over and over again. Even with kudzu, if you cut it back often enough, eventually it runs out of, out of energy, but it's very time consuming and very difficult.
Okay, and then Gail wanted to let us know the Juglandaceae, did I say that right, are a plant family known as the walnut family. The 9 or 10 genera, I don't know the terminology, in the family have a total of around 50 species and include the commercially important nut producing trees, walnut, pecan, and hickory.
Yes, Gail is there as my backup. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have any more questions typed down here, but if anyone has another question, you can type it, or if you'd like, you can be adventurous and you can unmute yourself, and we can have a little short chat.
So Christine, our church planted a vegetable garden, and I noticed that some of the plants, like the green bean plants, are getting all the leaves eaten off by, I think, some little creatures. Is there anything I can put around them that won't hurt the little creatures, that will just keep them from coming near?
So I have read, and I've tried this, I will admit, without success in my own garden, that if you plant things like dill and basil, like interspersed among your vegetable garden, these are very, very aromatic plants, that they can produce a scent that some insects don't like. As I said, I haven't noticed that it helps with my green beans, but I keep trying.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Hank, do you have a question?
And actually, I was not the one who talked about the bamboo. Actually, my dad was the one who had that question.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have better news for you with bamboo.
It's okay.
Okay, well, we've got some nice messages. Awesome job, Christine. Nice break from the workday. And someone else says, thank you, learned a bunch. So, and someone says, Patricia says, glad to have Munch and Learn back. So that's really great. We're glad to have Munch and Learn back. Any way we can have it also. So Margarita gave a little applaud. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Lisa gives a thumbs up. Kristen gives a little bit of applause. Gail, a thumbs up. Stacy, little applause. Oh, yay. Lots of people are doing it.
Aw, well, thank you all so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming, and come back again next week. We'll have another link on the website that you can get to come to next week. And next week is local artist Mary Kay Van Giesen. So thanks, Gail. Nice to meet you. Bye, Diane. Bye, Hank.
Sorry I was late. I was on the golf course, but I tried to get back as soon as I can.
Well, I'm glad to have you at some point.
Did anyone ask about roses while I was gone? Am I really bad to be using the, the immunocal, not, let's see, what is it? It's like the chemical that is a fungicide and insecticide.
Oh, is it the imiprazole?
Yes, that's what it is.
So, that's the one that has come under fire a lot lately because we know that it affects bees, right?
Oh.
Right. So, well, imiprazole is hard. that whole group of chemicals was manufactured to replace organophosphates, and in general, like they are less secondary environmental effects than organophosphates. So like in that sense, it is a better thing. The benefit of I think it's a neonicotinoid, if I'm remembering all of my chemistry correctly. The thing about neonics is that they're systemic. So the plant absorbs them, you only have to treat the roots, and it spreads through all part of the plant and protects that plant from insects. The bad thing about it is it spreads through all parts of the plant and protects that plant from insects. So if you're a pollinator and you land on the flower, then they can come into contact with the neonics or with the imiprazole. And then we see, like they've shown in honeybees and I think some bumblebees, there are some developmental effects perhaps. It may affect navigation and some other things. It's one of those, they're still exploring the effects. So in one sense, it is less harmful than an organophosphate. In the other, it may be causing some problems, and we hope that we can do better. What I've heard, like the recommendation I've heard is that if you have to use it to the label. Don't use any more than you have to, like more is not better anyway. So save yourself the cost and reduce the impact, and do administer it directly to the roots of that plant, like your roses in particular.
Did you also talk about the crepe myrtle sooty mold?
Like the bark scale thing?
Right.
It is, I hadn't heard it called that, but that makes sense.
Because that is definitely using the neonic, the aminoclad or whatever. And maybe you talked about it already.
I didn't, but I've looked into that because I have crepe myrtles and honeybees in my backyard. So yeah, it's the same issue, and you're right, it's the same treatment. What I found is that, like, I get bark scale every year, and then I get ladybug larvae, and my bark scale disappears.
Oh.
Yeah, so in fact, the ladybugs that I get, like ladybug larvae, depending on the species, look very different. Like I've tried to find pictures, and you can go down that rabbit hole forever. Some of them are very creepy looking. My ladybug larvae that I get look a lot like the bark scale. They're just like bigger white fuzzy things. So, and there's some cool native ladybugs in particular that are really good predators of that, which unfortunately means they're not the ones that you can buy at the, mail order or buy to put in your garden. A lot of those ladybugs are actually the invasive species, the Asian lady beetle. So, yeah, again, like if bark scale is decimating your crepe myrtle and you've got to do something about it, then that is the recommended treatment, unless you have time to go out there and scour with a brush. Like mechanical removal works, but not great. And then you're like, yeah, it's hard. Again, if it's something you have to use it to the label, use as little as possible, and administer it directly to the base of the plant.
I wonder if honeybees even go to crepe myrtle blossoms.
I don't
If they
know.
don't, maybe that wouldn't be a problem so much.
Right. Well, what we worry about is like if it's happening with the honeybee, then it's probably affecting other insect pollinators as well. Like that's the broader issue. Honeybees are the one that we can see it affecting because it's the one that we keep in the box and can go out and check on. Right. But yeah, I don't know. Now I'm curious. I have to go watch my crepe myrtles.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I missed the majority of your talk.
That's okay. I think it's recorded, right?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And so it will go on as long as everything worked correctly. And I do have a recording message up here on the corner. It will be on our YouTube station, which you can get to through our website.
Okay. Thanks, Lindley.
Sure.
So good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Diane. Okay, well, thank you once again, Christine. This has been so much fun.
Thank you. I appreciate you facilitating.
Sure. I enjoy doing that. Okay, if anyone else has any questions, it's your last chance. I'm about to end everything. It always hurts me to end it. I always just want to keep it going. Okay, well, thank you very much. And Christine, I will send you a form for a Dixon membership as a thank you for doing this, because I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
I'm going to close it out. Have a great day. Bye.